Hi, welcome to Yellow's Talker Show. I'm DV LeBron. Today, my very special guest is Mr. Guy Stevens, who is the founding and executive director of the Alliance for Against Seclusion and Restraint. How you doing, sir?
Hey, I'm doing really well. And happy to be here. And I appreciate that kind introduction.
Now, let me show you what I'm talking about, folks. This right here is an autistic kid being put in restraints. This had happened several times. It's a case that happened in Weatherford, and this is what happens when they have to restrain autistic kids. And these things are traumatic experiences for someone that doesn't understand what's going on around them. Guy, thank you so much again for being on the show to talk about this issue that's affecting our special needs children. Can you go ahead and tell the audience just quick about you?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. The Alliance is an organization, a nonprofit that I started a little over 5 years ago. And I started the Alliance not because I had a sudden strike of inspiration that I needed to focus on restraint and seclusion, but rather I had a son who's neurodivergent. Who was restrained, secluded, and traumatized in a Maryland public school. And to be honest with you, I don't know that I would have even imagined that physical restraint and seclusion were things that might have been done to a kid. And again, I don't know that I would have imagined those things being done to a kid in a school setting. I don't know that I would imagine those things being done to a kid with a disability who was having a hard time. But unfortunately, they were done. They were done to my son, and it led him to a significant amount of trauma. Being physically restrained, being put in seclusion is a really traumatic experience. And just to give a little bit of context here for your listeners, as I mentioned, so the first time I heard the words restraint seclusion in the context of a school, I was kind of surprised. I would not imagine those things that would have been done to a kid. And, so to give some background on what we're talking about, when we're talking about a physical restraint, we're talking about one or more adults holding a child, sometimes in a standing position, sometimes in a seated position, sometimes down on the ground. But we're talking about multiple adults holding a child and preventing them from moving on their own. It really is something that is more akin to what most people are used to seeing in a law enforcement setting, seeing somebody being held down after being apprehended by law enforcement. And, these things actually happen much more frequently than people think in schools around the nation. And, you mentioned it, but, if you look at the kids that are more likely to be physically restrained, they're children with disabilities. Black and brown children more likely to be restrained. Kids that already have a trauma history more likely to be restrained. What we find is it's often very young children as well. So, you're often talking about, a young autistic child being physically restrained in a school context. And seclusion is another practice that happens in many schools. And similar, seclusion is putting a child in a room or an area against their will and not letting them out. And this is a practice that often happens in small padded rooms that look like closets, where a kid is drugged there against their will, put in that room and prevented from leaving. It is a traumatic thing to do to a child. And again, these are things that have been happening across Texas, across the country. Like I said, I never even knew these things happened until they happened to my son. So anyway, that led me on a journey to start this organization to look at the impact of physical restraint seclusion. And of course, that expanded over time. It's not just restraint seclusion for us. It's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. We still have 19 states that allow you to hit a kid in school in the name of discipline. Even above that, it's really kind of all the things that are often done to kids, very often in the name of behavior. And a lot of these things are really harmful. And there are better things we can be doing. So anyway, I could talk a lot, but that's what's okay. Here is I started on this journey because, I know you and I had a chance to catch up a little bit, but a lived experience with my son, a lived experience that ultimately led me to quit a job I'd been at for well over 20 years to begin advocating for children and really trying to make a difference.
Yeah. And we share in that. I didn't know anything about this. And me and my family and I had to live this experience with my autistic daughter, where a local school district, they restrained and secluded my daughter, which caused serious harm. And you know, it became quite a bit of an issue there, and we're still dealing with the trauma.
Right.
A lot of these holds are, like you said, they're reminiscent of what's used. You said in a law enforcement setting, in a correctional setting, they are used in correctional settings to restrain inmates. It is something that definitely, it's a subject that not only is near to me, but that parents need to understand that this is happening. Whether you have a special needs kid or not, you got to understand that this is happening. And it has to be addressed. It's something that we need to do away with. We need to come up with a better system for this. So can you talk to me, Guy? Because if there's one thing that's misunderstood with special education children, is that they're just bad. They're just being bad. They're a lot of parents, or a parent that wouldn't know, or maybe they need the belt. They need some discipline. Their parents didn't do it. They don't understand manifestations. Right. And how frustrating the world can be for a kid who's autistic, or a kid who's even got ADHD. How frustrating the world can be, how frustrating a classroom setting could be when they have an answer and they can't get it out, or they can't understand exactly. They're dyslexic, so it's all coming in garbled. So can you talk about that, how it pertains to that, those manifestations from
Sure. Yeah. And that's a really excellent point. And one of the things that I'll say to you is that I often travel around the country and do virtual presentations where I talk about topics like this. And one of the presentations that I often give is kind of talking about how kids are misunderstood in the name of behavior. It's how do we shift away from misunderstanding kids, because there's a tremendous impact for kids who are misunderstood in the name of behavior. So what do I mean by misunderstood in the name of behavior? What I mean is that there are certain kids that we know by looking at the data that we have across this country, in Texas, across the country, who are more likely to be restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment. If we look at that data, we very quickly learn that the kids that are more likely to be subjected to those things are children with disabilities, Black and brown children, kids with a trauma history, often very young children. So if you think about this, all these things we're doing to kids, restraint and seclusion, 80% of the restraints that are reported on a federal level, and that data is far from perfect, but 80% children with disabilities, 77% of seclusions. Anywhere else in the world, if one population, a small population, was being targeted 80% of the time, we would say, well, wait a second, what's happening here? And that's what we need to do. There's a real problem here. And what happens is that, restraint and seclusion were things that worked their way into our schools probably in the 70s. And you've got to go back in time a little bit and realize that there was a period of time where children with disabilities were not even welcome in our schools. It was not until the predecessor of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that many kids were included and actually allowed to come to school and get a public education. And, the practices of restraint and seclusion began coming into schools because people didn't know what else to do. And these practices at that point were things that were used in acute psychiatric hospitals, in prison settings and other settings. And interestingly enough, if we look here in 2024, there are actually acute psychiatric facilities that have eliminated seclusion and restraint. There are juvenile justice facilities that have eliminated restraint and seclusion. Yet these are common practices in a lot of our schools. So why are kids misunderstood? Kids are misunderstood for a lot of reasons. Often it's a matter of people not having adequate knowledge about disabilities. It's a matter of how people view disabilities. I happen to be a huge proponent of what's called the social model of disability. There are two different constructs for disability that people often talk about. One is the medical model, and the medical model looks at disability through a lens of, deficit, kind of what's wrong with someone, where are they lagging, looks through a very medically oriented lens at kind of what's wrong with the person. A social construct of disability looks at the world and says, how do we remove barriers for people? People that are not able to access things, how do we make the world more accessible to them? And sometimes even the way we look at individuals with disabilities is with that very low expectation, deficit mindset. And as a result, we treat them differently. People with disabilities are often treated very poorly. We believe very firmly in what we would call neurodiversity affirming, even just understanding that there are different ways that people are wired, and that's okay. There are different ways of being. But very often we find ourselves in education looking through a compliance-based lens of our job being to make people do the things we want them to do. And when they can't, we double down on the things to try to make them do those things without really understanding why they're having a difficult time. So there's a number of reasons that I think kids are misunderstood in the name of behavior. Some of it even goes down to the approaches that we're using in schools and in homes as well around behavior. A lot of the approaches around behavior today are very focused on kind of the science of behaviorism. And behaviorism is science that really, about 100 years ago, the work of people like B.F. Skinner and others were looking into things like operant conditioning, reward and consequence. How different, incentives might change behavior. Well, a lot of our schools work on these same kind of models where they look at kids through a lens of behavior being intentional. And when you look through a lens of behavior being intentional, when a kid doesn't do what you want them to do, you do one of two things. You offer them either an incentive to do the thing you want them to do, or a consequence or punishment to prevent them from doing the thing you don't want them to do. And what I would say to you is that behavior is more complex than that. Over the past few years, I've taken a deep dive, and I don't want to go too crazy here, but I've taken a deep dive into understanding behavior through a different lens. And part of that lens is modern neuroscience. We've actually learned more about the brain, the nervous system, and behavior over the last, say, 30 years than we knew in all of time before that. Yet a lot of our approaches around behavior are still very focused on compliance, rewards, and consequences. These programs and ideas are failing kids that need help the most. So, the point being is that a lot of kids are misunderstood in the name of behavior because people are looking through that lens of this is a choice. Someone's making bad choices. And the truth of the matter is behavior, you may have heard the term before, behavior is communication.
Mm-hmm.
I would nod my head and say, yeah, I agree with that. Behavior is communication. But if you go even more foundationally into it, behavior is biology. We are actually wired for survival. And what that means is our brain and our nervous system is designed to keep us safe. Well, what does that mean? It means when we don't feel safe, that we sometimes exhibit stress behaviors or do things that may seem surprising or disruptive or other things. So kids are very often having behaviors that are not intentional, but they're stress responses. And very often the kids that are most often on the other side of a lot of punitive and exclusionary discipline are kids with a trauma history, kids with disabilities. And what we actually know today is that trauma changes the brain. And I mean that literally. And those changes that occur in the brain related to trauma, they actually lead kids to feel less safe. And when a kid feels less safe, they're more likely to have what we would term as distress behaviors. And notice, I'm not saying misbehavior or bad behavior. There's a lot of behavior that occurs that's a result of the way someone feels. They don't feel safe. They might have a behavior that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to someone. But this is a matter of like development. It's a matter of individual differences. It's a matter of a lot of things. And very often when kids have those distress behaviors, what do? We meet them with the demand for compliance. Okay. Kids have a hard time. Kids a little dysregulated. Well, we want to make them do what we want to make them do. And what very often happens is that a well-intentioned adult not only fails to de-escalate a kid who's beginning to get escalated and having a hard time, very often they escalate the kid. And that leads then to a big behavior which might lead a kid to be physically restrained or put into a seclusion room. And the interesting thing is that restraint or seclusion is traumatizing to that kid. And the further you traumatize a kid, the more you change their brain, the more they're likely to have distressed behavior. So these things that we're doing to kids that are misunderstood in the name of behavior are actually leading to an increase, not a decrease in behaviors. And that's why, if you look at what's happening here, this is really concerning. But the same kids that are more likely to be restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment, these same children will be over punished. They will have lots of consequences. They will have lots of attempted ways of changing their behavior, and these kids will eventually not feel very safe or welcome at school. And when you
No,
don't feel safe and welcome, what happens? You disengage, and when you
right.
disengage, you're not learning. And when you disengage, you're more likely to drop out. You're more likely to have school refusal, like you don't want to go there. This doesn't feel like a safe, welcoming place. And you know what happens to those kids? They're more likely to end up dropping out, ending up in the juvenile justice system. We have a lot of kids that are on this pathway that end up in the criminal justice system.
You talk about that. You on your page, you talk about that guy. You talk about the school to prison
Prison
kind of
pipeline.
pipeline. What is it? Disability Rights Texas has something on that, and Texas Appleseed, I think it is, where they're going from. They start with these disciplines for these special needs, and they just escalate till they boot them out, and then they become a criminal problem, and that's a real thing happening. Can you kind of briefly touch on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's exactly where I was headed. Is that these kids that are on the wrong end of a lot of punitive approaches and exclusionary discipline, they're far more likely to end up kind of traveling in that school to prison pipeline. If you look at data for our state and federal prisons, I'm not going to get the number exact here, but it's about 65% of inmates and prisoners identify with having some sort of disability. Autism, ADHD, learning disabilities. We are failing a lot of our children with disabilities, and we're failing them on a pathway that's leading a lot of kids to prison. I mean, that's part of the reason. I mean, I started this work because what was done to my son. And I'll share with you that today my son is doing really well. My son is in college. He's doing fantastic.
That's
But I
wonderful.
continue to do this work because there are many kids out there who don't have anyone in their corner advocating for them, whose parents, caregivers, families have been led to believe that the things that are being done to them are necessary, and it's causing a lot of harm. And there's a lot of kids that are ending up with really poor outcomes, and it's heartbreaking, and it's avoidable. We can do more to better support kids that are not being well served as well. And this is kind of the kicker here. The same things that we can do to better support a lot of our children with disabilities, a lot of our kids that have trauma history, the same thing we can do to better support those kids actually can lead to better outcomes for the teachers and staff as well. However, that's not immediately obvious to a lot of people. A lot of times people are like, well, what do you expect us to do when this situation happens? Or, and they're doing a lot of these things that are harmful and quite frankly, can be traumatic, not just for the kids, but also for the adults. I mean, I'll tell you this, and you probably know this from your background. There is nothing, pleasant about if you're ever involved in a situation where you had to restrain someone. There's nothing pleasant about being in that situation. In fact, it can be quite traumatic for an adult in that situation as well. And unfortunately, the trauma that an adult might suffer in a situation like that can lead them to be hypervigilant, can lead them to not feel safe. And when they don't feel safe, guess what? They're more likely to go to a known intervention, even if it's not working. So the more an adult does it, the more they find that they're doing it again. The more you do it to a kid, the more you traumatize them, the more likely they are to have behavior.
Well, trauma causes you to, and I know this as a veteran with PTSD,
Mhm.
that trauma causes you to go fight, flight. You go to the actions you know. Those are the
Absolutely.
ones that you go, and you kind of skip the thought part up here and go straight to the action back there. And trauma. While trauma affects everybody differently, you're right. There has been studies, MRIs show that there's differences in the actual chemistry of the brain and how it fires off
Yeah, and form and function there, form and function, and you know that brain piece is really important because guess what? You know, if we look at our brain, and I don't want to go deeply into brain science here, but if we look at our brain and look at a couple parts of our brain, you know, kind of the front top of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's kind of the thinking, logical, rational part of our brain. That part of the brain that develops last. That develops over a long period of time. Our brains develop over a period of probably 25 to 30 years, and it can be variant for different people. But the last part of the brain to fully develop is that prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is really responsible for our logical, rational decision making, all of those things. Well, if we go further into our brain, we have things like our amygdala. Our amygdala is our internal threat detection system, right? People that have experienced trauma, that threat detection system is kind of over vigilant, over sensitive. So people that have experienced a lot of trauma, and I'm sure that with your experience, you can speak to this, that amygdala may put somebody into a fight or flight response mode when objectively other people would say, well, it seemed like a safe situation. There wasn't anything going on. But that person, because trauma comes back as a reaction, not a memory. Bessel van der Kolk said that. And this idea that you just kind of react, you don't think, because what happens is when you're dysregulated, whether you're a child or an adult, when you become dysregulated, that prefrontal cortex, the thinking, logical, rational part of our brain, it goes offline. And when you factor in the fact that kids' brains are not little miniature adult brains, they're not fully developed, they already have less capacity for some of these things. You begin to factor in individual differences and disabilities. You know, we put expectations on kids that aren't sometimes realistic, and we're trying to push kids to do things. You know, this idea of kind of can't versus won't is really important. Very often people look at a kid who's having a hard time and think they won't do that. They're choosing not to do that. But very often when a kid's having a hard time, they can't do it. We all have a capacity that changes from moment to moment and depends on like the stressors that we're under and the things that are going on. And if you take a child, for instance, and let's just use an example, you know, if you look at the data, you know, autistic children far more likely to be restrained and secluded. Non-speaking autistic children more likely to be restrained and secluded. And you tie that back to the trauma piece. A non-speaking autistic child who has wants and needs that they are unable to communicate, that can be really traumatic for that child. And, you know, what we might see is that may lead to, you know, a behavior that kind of leads us down that road. But that child may have sensory, may have sensory differences that make, the buzzing down the hall that you don't notice, but that's a stressor on them. And we all have kind of like this window of tolerance where we're able to function and do well. Well, when you begin to pile stressors on a kid, you decrease that capacity.
Who already a kid who, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but a kid who already this child, and we talked about the development of the brain and how it takes 25, 30 years to really. So you have a kid who the brain isn't even close to fully developed, and it's not quite developing like what would be, I don't know, for a better lack of a word, common. Let's say common.
Yeah. Well, and we can talk about neurotypical, right?
Neurotypical. Sure. There you go.
Right.
Neurotypical. Yep. So it's not, and then they're having to process this. And then what you were saying about the buzzard and stuff, when you put a kid in that is autistic in a blank room and you close it up, they don't have any stimulation for that they need. It has an effect on them, and a very real effect, not just feeling claustrophobic, but just that everything is blank. It's not good for them, especially 10 hours inside one of those ISS rooms, which was something that was happening to a lot of special needs kids. It is awful. What do you say to the people who say, well, we're doing it for their safety? Yeah. Because that is one that you hear often. Oh, they were going to hurt themselves. Right. Can you touch on that?
Absolutely. So the first thing I'll say is that one of the challenges here around specifically an issue like restraint and seclusion is that there is currently no federal law around the use of restraint and seclusion in schools around the country. There are federal laws that are out there that affect law enforcement or medical settings, but there's no federal law when it comes to restraint and seclusion in schools across the country. Now, what that means is that every state is on their own in terms of what their laws might say, and how they might enforce their laws, and a whole host of things. But there is some variation kind of looking across the country. Now, federal guidance. What federal guidance says, and federal guidance came out in 2012 initially, in a document released by the Department of Education. And federal guidance in 2012 that came out said restraint and seclusion are things that only should ever be considered in a crisis situation where you have tried all other approaches that you can try, and they are necessary to prevent the threat of imminent serious physical harm. Now, imminent serious physical harm actually has a legal definition. Imminent serious physical harm, the legal definition is a four-part definition. I'm going to summarize it, but the summary is imminent serious physical harm is a potentially life-threatening situation. It is not a kick, a scratch, a bite, a thrown book. It is not a crumbled up paper. It is not defiance. It's not it's not non-compliance or disrespect. It is potentially life-threatening. So put this in your mind. The Department of Education, Federal Department of Education said, we don't recommend the use of restraint or seclusion unless crisis situation, tried everything else, and it's potentially life-threatening. Now, why is that important? Well, if we go back to 2009, in 2009, the Government Accountability Office, which is a federal government kind of watchdog organization, right? They released a report. The report was called Seclusions and Restraint, Selected Instances of Death and Abuse at Public and Private Schools and Treatment Center. This report highlighted hundreds of instances of death and abuse due to the use of restraint and seclusion in public and private schools and other types of facilities across the country. When that report came out, it actually got federal attention. In fact, Congress in 2009 tried to pass a bill that unfortunately did not pass, but it got a lot of attention. Now, let's take this a step further. You heard the guidance from the Department of Ed. You know, and I'll share with you, I mean, just as a personal story, my son, the last time he was physically restrained and secluded was 2018. It was the fall of 2018. I live in Maryland over on the East Coast. Around the same time that this happened to him, out on the West Coast, there was a young man named Max Benson. Max Benson was 13 years old, like my son. Max Benson was autistic, like my son. Max Benson liked collecting things. He liked nature. He liked the outdoors, like my son. Max Benson was put into a prone restraint at a school, and it killed him. It's heartbreaking. There are many kids that have died being physically restrained in schools across the nation, and people often are unaware of this. There was a case in Georgia where a young man hung himself in a seclusion room, was left in an unsupervised seclusion room and hung himself. The impact is really, really significant. So if you know that kids have died being physically restrained and secluded, you've got to think about it in this way. You've got to say, well, the use of physical restraint is the use of potentially deadly force. And my question for you is, if we look at the data and I say, when would it be appropriate to use potentially deadly force on a 7-year-old autistic child? I'm not going to say never, but I would say it should be really extremely unusual. I was talking to a parent today, an advocate rather today, who was working with a parent of a 7-year-old girl with a disability who was being restrained. My question, of course, is looking at the law that was in the law in Maryland was, okay, well, tell me about the imminent serious physical harm. Was this a potentially life-threatening situation? It almost never is. So, these things can be deadly. They should be rare. I happen to believe that putting a child in a room or area against their will and not letting them out, I don't believe that's ever appropriate. I don't believe that seclusion is ever appropriate. And people say things like, well, the kid needed a place to calm down. There is nothing calming about being put into a room against your will and not be let out. Kids go in those rooms, they bang, they scream, they scratch their nails, they may urinate or defecate. That's not intentional. That's a stress response. Maybe in 20 minutes, a half an hour, maybe they slouch against the wall, they put their head down. That is not what you're seeing there. Is not a kid calming down. You're seeing a kid going into a brainstem state where they're shutting down. They're shutting down. It is so traumatic. And kids go into dissociative states in those rooms. So, we don't believe that seclusion is ever appropriate. And I would say to you that, physical restraint should be really, really rare. If you think about it through that idea of, potentially life-threatening situation, if you're in a school or district where every day they're restraining kids, then that means that every day they're assessing that there's a potentially life-threatening situation. No, I don't
Yeah.
believe that. And if it is, then that's an extremely unsafe place and
It-
needs serious attention. The truth, though, is that more often than not, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but more often than not, kids are not restrained and secluded for that potentially life-threatening situation. It's because somebody says a situation's unsafe. And there is a huge canyon between unsafe and imminent serious physical harm. And some of it's misunderstanding, some of it's not knowing what else to do.
when you're dealing with special education, and this is what I've learned from advocating from my oldest child to, advocating for my child that went through, because she came out of that ISS room disassociated after
Yeah.
screaming, after going through, the stuff, banging her head and completely just distraught. And then, a teacher, talked about how my daughter was street smart. So, obviously she knew what was going on. And, I kindly reminded that teacher that I was from the street. My daughter grew up in Midlothian, Texas. There's no Midlothian cripping going on here. It's
Right.
it's very, very suburb and of Dallas. So anyway,
Well, people often do that. People often put intent into kids that isn't there, and they look at behavior through a lens of all behavior being intentional. Okay, I've sat in IEP team meetings for kids with disabilities, and heard people talking about their behavior and talking about how they were manipulating or they were doing these things. Like I've heard adults come up with these. Well, they were doing this to manipulate that to get this, and they would explain these scenarios, and I'm like, I don't even know if I'm smart enough to do that manipulation that you're talking about here. That's not
Mhm.
what my kid was doing. This is a kid that was having a hard time, not a kid that was giving you a hard time.
Yeah.
But very often people aren't aware. I mean, we look now, I mean, if you look through the neuroscience lens of this, we have two different kinds of behavior. We have top-down behavior. Top-down behavior, it's using that cortex. It's thoughtful, it's rational, it's logical. We also have kind of bottom-up behavior. Bottom-up behavior is this idea that it's our brain and our nervous system trying to keep us safe. And our behavior may be a stress response. It may be that we are overwhelmed. We're not able to do the meet the demand that's placed on us. And this behavior is coming out of a place of distress, not a place of intent. But very often people look at all behavior as being a matter of intent. And quite frankly, I mean, that's just wrong. And they put assumptions on kids like, well, they're doing this to get it's attention seeking, it's avoidance, it's escape, it's trying to get something.
It's always something. I mean, I was really surprised on what a mastermind my 11-year-old
Right.
happened to be.
Right,
And that
right,
it
right.
was just amazing how she could plot these and influence all these people with master's degrees all around her.
Right,
I
right.
mean,
Yet wasn't able to meet her IEP goals, right? Not able
yeah,
to master these goals over here,
yeah,
but able to be this mastermind. Like, I mean, that's a brilliant way of putting it. And I mean, I felt the same. I felt the same about 7-year-olds that I've heard people like, I'm not even mentally capable of thinking that thing up you just accused that kid of.
yeah. No, it's amazing. No, I,
Yeah.
I I was really like in shock by it. But what is the first step that a parent should take if their kid is restrained? What do you recommend? Well, I mean, I'm not sure if you're in that scope, but you probably know people who are. What does a parent do if their kid's been restrained?
Yeah. So and this is I think a great question, and it's a long answer, but I'll try to make it a little more condensed. There's a lot of things that you can do. I mean, first of all, if you find out that your child is being restrained or secluded, it's important to know what your law says. And looking up Texas law, you can see what the law says in Texas about the use of restraint, the use of isolation, the use of seclusion. It's important to know the law because you'll find that often your child may be being restrained in a way that's not consistent with state law, because people often that are doing it don't know what the law says, or have misconceptions, or have been trained in a way where they have beliefs that just aren't aligned. So know what your law says. Listen to your child, validate your child's experience and feelings, be there to support them. If they are being physically restrained, this is a potentially traumatic event. And again, I don't want to make this. I want to really emphasize this, but as you know, I think from your own experiences, that kind of trauma can be with you for a lifetime. There's a misconception like kids are resilient and they're just going to bounce back. When you look at a physical restraint or you look at dragging somebody to a seclusion room, it is very akin to a violent crime. And nowhere in the world would we take somebody that experienced a violent crime and expect them to go back to that same location and act like nothing happened the next day. But we will restrain a kid on a Monday and expect them to be back in school on a Tuesday as if nothing happened. So
Yeah.
listen and validate your kid's experience. Get them help if they need it. They may need some counseling or therapy around this. This can be tough, and you may as well. If your child is being restrained and secluded at school, this can be very traumatic on the adults as well. And I'm sure you can relate to that as well. So you've got to also take care of yourself. But there are a number of things you can do. I always recommend beginning with best intent of collaboration. Can you collaborate with your school or your school system? Can you tell them what works for your child? Can you suggest things that may help them to better support your child? That's always a great place to start. There are people that are receptive. There are people that will listen. There are people that will help to do the things to support your child. There are systems that are not ready for change either, and sometimes that requires a stronger approach. We have a attorney that we've worked with who wrote what we call a no consent letter. No consent letter basically is a letter that you send to your school district and say, I do not consent to the use of physical restraint or the seclusion on my child. Now, does that letter change the law and mean they can no longer restrain and seclude your child? No. But what it does is it signals that you have a concern around this. And you also in that letter kind of make it known that like you want to work with them proactively to avoid getting into situations that they may deem those things to be necessary. So a no consent letter might be something people do. If your child's being restrained, you may file a complaint. There are several avenues for filing complaints. And the use of a physical restraint can lead to a situation where a child is not able to access their education. In 2016, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights put out what's called a Dear Colleague letter. And a Dear Colleague letter is a guidance letter to states. And this Dear Colleague letter talked about how the use of seclusion and restraint could lead to a denial of a free and appropriate public education. Now, FAPE is the word that we often use. FAPE is appropriate public education. It is the letter of the law in the United States. In the United States, and a child with a disability is guaranteed a free and appropriate public education. If you are restraining a child in school or secluding a child in school, it can lead to a denial of a free and appropriate public education. In their guidance in 2016, the Office of Civil Rights said, if you only ever restrained a kid once, it could have such an impact that it could affect their ability to get a free and appropriate public education. So, you can actually file a complaint, a federal complaint with the Office of Civil Rights if you think that a restraint is preventing your child from getting a free, appropriate public education. You can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights if you think that your child is being discriminated against as a child with a disability. And, if you look at the data, again, more often than not, it's children with disabilities being restrained. You can file a complaint with the Department of Justice. They're actually looking at issues around restraint and seclusion as well. Sometimes people hire attorneys and go through civil litigation processes. There's a lot of things that you can do. My biggest advice is, one, do something, and two, support your child. Do whatever you have to do to support your child. And it's really tough because, I ran into a situation where after we experienced restraint and seclusion initially, my son was afraid to go back to school.
Yes,
We,
absolutely.
we actually ended up homeschooling my son for about 2 years. Now, we were in a situation that we could do that. It wasn't easy. We had to make changes and make sacrifices to do it, but we were able to do it. Not everybody's able to do that. Not everybody's able to just say, okay, we're going to homeschool our child. And nor should you have to. But you do want to really think critically. And, gosh, I've seen situations where these things are happening daily to kids. And, in the back of my mind is this thought that, you could send your kid to school and have them not come home. You've got to really take these things seriously. And I'll tell you that parents that sometimes raise these concerns about this are sometimes gaslit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're led to believe things that aren't true. They're led to believe that these things are necessary. We work with did some work in Illinois at one point, and there was a school district, excuse me, there was a school there, a non-public school. It was a school that worked primarily with kids with disabilities, and they were spreading information that prone restraint was safe and therapeutic.
Yeah.
Yeah, they actually submitted a letter to the editor of the Chicago Tribune, saying that prone restraint was safe and therapeutic. I read it. I almost fell out of my chair. I then got up and started typing and sent them my own letter, which they also published, which totally debunked the lie that they were telling, because prone restraint is not a safe and therapeutic intervention. It is a potentially life-threatening intervention.
Yeah, it is. What is the biggest impediment to getting this is because this is something you're doing every day, and I love you for doing it. God bless you for doing this, for fighting this fight, brother. I really, God bless you, but you're fighting this every day. What's the biggest impediment to getting change in this line, where one day we don't have to worry about this happening to neurodivergent children?
Yeah. Yeah, I wish there was one big one we could just instantly move out of the way. We focus in a couple areas. We focus on legislation because I do believe, first of all, I believe that we should have federal law around the use of restrained seclusion. And there is a bill right now that is in front of Congress called the Keeping All Students Safe Act.
Did you go up to Washington for that? Or
I unfortunately had to travel to Florida, so I'm in Florida today, and wasn't able to attend. But that particular bill, which has been introduced a number of times, but that particular bill would ban prone and supine restraint, kind of on the ground restraints. It would ban like mechanical restraints where you might use a device to restrain someone. It would ban the use of seclusion. More importantly, though, it would provide funding for schools to put in place alternative approaches. And here's the thing, there are alternative approaches. There are better things that we can do rather than restraining and secluding kids. But federal law, we've not made much progress on federal law. It's unfortunate, it's unfortunate that often in our legislative system on the federal level and state level, things become partisan and they just don't move. And this has been a bill that hasn't moved. I would love to see it move. And I think it could make a difference. The way I look at this, your daughter's rights should not vary from state to state. Like if you were to pick up and move tomorrow to, Oklahoma or Arizona or wherever it might be, you should have, certain rights that would follow your child. And I look at restraint and seclusion and look at the data and think, this is a civil rights issue. It's a disability rights issue. It's a human rights issue. So there's been a big barrier to getting federal law passed. But, if I think about the barriers, yes, legislative, the lack of movement on the legislative front is a big barrier, and it's frustrating. One of the things I think is more important, though, if I've got to be honest with you, is how do we educate people? How do we get people to understand that these things that we're doing aren't working? These things that we're doing are leading to poor outcomes. And these things that we're doing are actually not supporting you as well as they could be if you're an educator. So we spend a lot of time around kind of working on education. And that can look like I go to conferences and events around the country and try to speak on this topic, joining a podcast, like coming on your podcast, speaking about this. We're actually right now in a partnership that's really pretty significant. And it's significant towards change. And that partnership is with a company called Crisis Prevention Institute. Crisis Prevention Institute, CPI, interestingly enough, is the company whose training was used in my school district where my son was being restrained. CPI teaches the use of restraint. So you might say to yourself, well, why on earth would the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint be working with CPI? Well, about a year and a half ago, after many, many discussions, we began a collaborative partnership to develop new training with CPI to move upstream and help move people away from restrictive interventions. So we're actually CPI is putting the program out next month. It's called Reframing Behavior, and this program is all about kind of going upstream. I've always loved the quote from Desmond Tutu, which I'll try to get as right as I can. But rather than pulling people out of the river, how do we go upstream and figure out why they're falling in? And that's so important. This is a problem that we need to go upstream to fix. If we want to avoid people's perception that restraint is necessary, what can we do to go upstream to better support a child with disabilities or better support any student so that we don't get to a situation where we're seeing behaviors that might lead to that kind of intervention? So we're actually, involved in actually trying to change the training that's in schools across the country. CPI happens to be the largest in the nation in terms of this kind of training. And what's interesting is that our our partnership did not begin until one day, in talking to them, I said, look, if we were going to do something together, it would have to really be meaningful and impactful. And I need to know that you're kind of aligned. And what I asked of them, I said, if you were willing to come out in a press release and say you are aligned with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint in eliminating seclusion and reducing the use of restraint, that would be a really great starting point. And they agreed and put out a press release to say that they are aligned with us in that work. So I think it's really telling that the largest crisis management training company in the nation believes, as we do, that you should never put a kid in seclusion and that restraint should be exceedingly rare. Whenever you go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the things the thing that I find about this whole conversation is that right now there's a conversation about how we do corrections in the United States. And there is a big push to move away from solitary confinement.
Oh yeah.
Now that's a slightly different setting, and I have, some opinions towards it. I think, there are times when that's necessary, but it's definitely not meant to be a punishment. Mm-hmm. It is not a good way to do a punishment versus a good way to stop these people from actually killing somebody. That's a different thing. But there's a conversation about criminals that are in prison right now, not being put in seclusion. And there's laws being passed by that. Now we're talking about 8-year-old kids with autism who are being restrained. And this is hard to pass. It doesn't compute to me.
Well, you are exactly right. And there are states where there have been laws passed that prohibit the use of seclusion in juvenile justice, yet those same states allow it in their schools on their children with disabilities. I've actually worked with people that have worked in acute psychiatric facilities. I've worked with people that have worked in forensic settings. And if you know forensic settings, I mean, we're talking about, people that have, been put into those settings for really, these are really serious offenses often. And those settings where they've eliminated seclusion and reduced restraint, so we've been able, if you can eliminate seclusion from an acute psychiatric facility, you can't tell me you can't get rid of it in an elementary school. The problem is change is hard, right? Change is always hard. And I think that no teacher or educator becomes a teacher or educator because they want to restrain and seclude kids, right? Nobody thinks like this is something I want to do. Unfortunately, if you're a brand new teacher and you go into a school and this is what they do, and you're told, well, this is what we do when those children, and you know who those children are having a hard time, it might not feel right to them initially, and they might think, well, gee, I don't know about this, but they're told to do it. They're told by somebody in authority to do it, and because we put such a premium on compliance, we often end up complying with things that we probably shouldn't comply with. I mean, there have been famous experiments about things that humans would do to other humans when they're told by somebody in authority to do it. So these systems kind of prevail because we live in this culture where it's like, okay, well, maybe this isn't right, but this is what I'm being told to do, so it must be the thing to do. Nobody goes into this wanting to do these things, but once you're there, it sometimes is really hard to imagine a different solution. So, somebody might be in an environment right now and they're listening and they're like, yeah, well, what else do you want us to do? What should we do instead? And I'll tell you, I mean, there's a whole list of things that you can do instead. There are alternatives out there to physical restraint and seclusion. One of the things that I've talked about before is something called UCARU, which is a trauma-informed alternative to restraint and seclusion. There are a number of things that you can do differently, but of course, I believe that 90% of this is what we do upstream, and 95% of it is not changing the kids, with disabilities. It's changing the adult mindset. It's changing the way we look at behavior. It's moving away from this idea that kids that aren't doing what I asked them to do aren't doing it because they won't do it. They very often can't. They may not have the ability. They may not have a skill. They may be having a difficult time in that moment. There may be something that's kind of, sensory wise that's difficult for them. We all have a fluctuating capacity. Think about a day, and I'll use myself as an example here, but a day that, things have been really hectic and I've been running around and, everything has gone wrong. And then my wife, asked me something and I blow up. That wasn't a logical, rational decision, right? I was dysregulated, and we all become dysregulated. And in that moment where somebody asked me a simple question that normally would not be a big deal, it's a big deal at that moment. And that's not a thoughtful response. And I later feel terrible about it. Our kids do the same thing. They have stress responses, right? And kids with disabilities and neurodivergent kids more likely to have a more sensitive threat detection system, more likely to find themselves, hypervigilant and having stress-related behaviors. As adults, we can change the approach to supporting them, have a better understanding of kind of individual differences, and we can make positive success.
Before and you know what, I could talk to you all night, but unfortunately I gotta end it here soon. But do you do seminars with school boards and with schools to talk about different approaches to these things? Do you have a service that does that, or something you recommend? And then I'm gonna go ahead and put your website here on so people could see it.
Sure. So the short answer is yes. I'm always happy to work directly with schools, with school boards, with a district, with an individual school. In anyone, and we have. I mean, we've worked with some schools across the nation. What I always love is when you find a school or school board that's really receptive and looking to do something positive. Because again, I absolutely believe what I say here when I say to you that, the same things that we can do to reduce and eliminate punitive and exclusionary discipline, restraint, seclusion, those same things that we can do can improve the school climate and the school for the teachers and the staff as well. You really can have a positive outcome while doing the right thing. So yeah, absolutely. We're always happy to work with this. We offer consulting, as well, I do a lot of things freely as well, like community groups. Like a community group wants to, a special education PTA, wants to learn more about the topic. I'll pop in for a virtual conference any night of the week to, help out and raise awareness and try to promote some change. But also happy to work with a school or a district or others that are looking to, bring about a positive change.
Perfect. No, I definitely, I would love to be able to communicate with you more, because I want to be more educated. I'm coming up on, thankfully, after, 32 years of government service, I'm coming up on the end. And, when I retire, I've always been a person with purpose to help people. I love people. I want to help people, and purpose, whether it be for my brothers and sisters in arms to, these kids, these special needs kids, I want to help. So, this is part of that. There's such a need for special education advocates, unfortunately, because this is stuff that the school is supposed to be doing. Right. Unfortunately, there's a lot of need for that, but I'm not going to ramble on. I wanted to tell y'all about the website. He does have a website, and it has the articles about what's going on, and it has those resources. Remember that no consent letter that a guy was talking about? Ways to take action and tell Congress and volunteer. I mean, he's got this set up, and even donate, because this stuff is not free. And they do have a documentary project. Can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah. So we started working on a documentary now a couple of years ago, and I have a filmmaker that I partnered with on this. And we've done a number of interviews with both survivors that have gone through restraint seclusion, with people out there that are working in education and that have alternative approaches. And what we're trying to do is put together a film that would kind of highlight not only what the problem is, which is important. People need to understand what the problem is, but also get into some of the solutions. Because in my mind, this work that, I never, I quit a job that I was at for well over 20 years that I would have expected to retire from to do this work. I never expected to go down this road, but this is really important work. And in my mind, it's never been enough just to say, here's a problem. I believe it's a matter of saying, here's a problem, and there are solutions, and there are better things that we can do. And that's part of the documentary, is this idea that, okay, yes, there's an issue here, but here's what we can do, and here's how we can move in a better direction. So that's the intent of it. One of the challenges is we're trying to get funding to do the project. And even though I have a filmmaker that has volunteered time, it takes money to get this project over the finish line. And in fact, we're looking at some grant funding now to see if we can find something to help us finish it, because I'm anxious to get it done. So something else that we want to do.
Growing awareness is on these issues, and unfortunately it all takes money. It all really does take money. But again, thank you so much for being on the show. I got smarter. I learned some things, and it's some of it stuff was just appalling. It just that it's happening. And I hope that parents get some out of this and will look at the website. And whether your kid is special needs or not, these are children that are going through this abuse, and it needs to be stopped. And so I hope that you will educate yourself on that, and remember that there's really no bad kids. That those kids are, especially neurodivergent kids, they see the world in a very different way, and we have to try to meet, as adults, we have to meet the children. We do.
And very often misunderstood. And if I could just leave you with one final thought here in the vein of what you were saying, I think in probably almost every presentation I ever give, I include this quote, but it's the Maya Angelou quote about do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. We're in a position here where we know better, and knowing better, we should be doing better. And the final thing that I'll share is, anybody that's watching this, if we can help you in any way, or you're going through a situation, whether you're at a school, an educator, or you're a parent or a caregiver, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to have a conversation, and we've got volunteers as well that are always happy to support people. So I thank you for this opportunity to chat with you, and I hope this is the beginning of a more robust relationship. We'll have to talk about how we can collaborate.
Definitely. Can you stick around real quick after the show?
Sure.
Thank you.